Introduction. When justice became theater, welcome, fellow travelers through time, to a journey that will take us deep into the shadows of human history. Tonight, we're not visiting the gleaming marble columns of the Roman Forum or marveling at the engineering prowess of the aqueducts. Instead, we're venturing into the darker corners of the ancient world, where justice was a spectacle and punishment was an art form that would make modern horror writers weep with envy. Ancient Rome, the civilization that gave us roads, spanning continents, legal systems that still influence our courts today, and architectural marvels that have stood for millennia, also perfected the art of human suffering in ways that defy imagination. These weren't just crude acts of violence born from barbarism. They were carefully crafted, methodical, and often symbolic demonstrations of power that served multiple purposes: deterrence, entertainment, religious appeasement, and psychological warfare. As we embark on this exploration, take a moment to settle in. Perhaps dim the lights, let the soft hum of evening settle around you, and prepare yourself for stories that will challenge your understanding of justice, morality, and the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance. From the sacred virgins buried alive in underground tombs to the elaborate death contraptions that turned execution into performance art, we'll uncover the methods, meanings, and madness behind some of history's most disturbing judicial practices. But before we dive into these dark waters, it's worth asking ourselves, why study these horrors at all? What can we learn from examining humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty? The answer lies not in glorifying violence, but in understanding how civilizations have used punishment as a tool of control, how religious beliefs shaped judicial practices, and how the spectacle of suffering served political ends that extended far beyond simple retribution. The Roman Empire, at its height, stretched from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to Syria. It governed millions of people across vastly different cultures, languages, and traditions. To maintain order across such a diverse and sprawling territory, Rome developed a complex system of laws, customs, and punishments that were designed not just to punish wrongdoers, but to send clear messages about power, authority, and the consequences of challenging the established order. These punishments were rarely private affairs. They were public spectacles, carefully choreographed events that drew crowds, inspired fear, and reinforced social hierarchies. The arena wasn't just for gladiatorial games, it was a stage where justice was performed, where the power of the state was displayed in all its terrible glory. As we journey through these dark chapters of human history, we'll discover that Roman punishments were often highly symbolic, reflecting deep-seated beliefs about religion, family, honor, and social order. The specific methods of execution or torture were rarely chosen arbitrarily. They were carefully selected to match the crime, to reflect cosmic justice, or to appease various deities who were believed to govern different aspects of human life. We'll also explore how these ancient practices evolved, influenced later civilizations, and sometimes found their way into medieval European justice systems, creating a continuous thread of institutionalized cruelty that would persist for centuries. From the Roman practice of decimation to the medieval refinements of psychological torture, we'll trace the dark lineage of judicial punishment through the ages. So, as we prepare to descend into this historical underworld, remember that these aren't just stories from a distant past. They're windows into the human soul, reflections of our capacity for both justice and vengeance, mercy and cruelty. They remind us that the thin veneer of civilization can sometimes give way to practices that reveal the most disturbing aspects of human nature. Let us begin this journey with one of Rome's most chilling practices, the fate that awaited the sacred guardians of the eternal flame when they broke their most fundamental vow. Chapter 1. The Vestal Virgins, Sacred Guardians, and Living Tombs. The sacred flame and its guardians. In the heart of ancient Rome, in a circular temple dedicated to Vesta, goddess of the hearth and home, burned a fire that was never supposed to die. This wasn't just any fire, it was the sacred flame that Romans believed protected the very essence of their civilization. The responsibility for maintaining this eternal flame fell to a select group of women known as the Vestal Virgins, whose lives were bound by vows so sacred that breaking them meant facing one of the most terrifying punishments the ancient world had ever devised. The Vestal Virgins were more than just priestesses. They were living symbols of Rome's purity, stability, and divine favor. Selected as young girls, typically between the ages of 6 and 10, These children were chosen from Rome's most prestigious families through a process that was both honor and sacrifice. Once selected, a girl would spend 30 years in service to Vesta, 10 years learning her duties, 10 years performing them at full capacity, and 10 years teaching the younger initiates. Only after these 3 decades could she leave the order, marry, and live a normal life if she survived that long. The selection process itself was steeped in ritual and superstition. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, would personally choose the candidates from a pool of eligible girls. These girls had to meet strict criteria. They must be born of free parents, have no physical defects, and come from families with pristine reputations. The moment a girl was chosen, she was legally removed from her father's authority and placed under the protection of the stater, protection that would prove to be both blessing and curse. Life as a Vestal virgin came with extraordinary privileges that no other women in Roman society could claim. They lived in luxury in the house of the Vestals, a complex near the Roman Forum that included beautiful gardens, spacious living quarters, and every comfort the ancient world could provide. They had the best seats at public games and theatrical performances, rode in ornate carriages through the city streets, and commanded respect from even the highest-ranking officials. Perhaps most remarkably, they had the power to grant pardons to condemned criminals with a simple word, authority, that even Roman senators envied. But these privileges came with an absolute and non-negotiable requirement: complete chastity. For 30 years, these women were forbidden any romantic or sexual contact with men. They were living embodiments of purity, and their virginity was considered essential to the spiritual health of Rome itself. Romans believed that the city's prosperity, military success, and divine protection all depended on the Vestals maintaining their sacred vows. This belief wasn't merely superstitious. It was woven into the very fabric of Roman identity. When military campaigns failed, when plagues struck, when earthquakes shook the city, Romans would often look first to the Vestal virgins. Had one of them been unchaste, had they allowed the sacred fire to die, the welfare of millions could hang on the behavior of these 6 women. The unthinkable crime and its investigation, given the enormous importance placed on Vestal purity. Accusations of unchastity were matters of supreme gravity that could shake the foundations of Roman society. Such accusations didn't arise from mere gossip or personal vendettas, though these certainly played a role. More often, they emerged during times of crisis, when Romans sought explanations for military defeats, natural disasters, or other calamities that seemed to indicate divine displeasure. The investigation of a Vestal virgin accused of breaking her vow was a process that combined religious ritual, legal procedure, and political maneuvering in ways that would seem bizarre to modern observers. The accused Vestal would be brought before a special tribunal, usually presided over by the Pontifex Maximus himself. The proceedings were part trial, part religious ceremony, and part public spectacle. Evidence in such trials could range from eyewitness testimony to divine signs and omens. Slaves could be tortured to extract testimony as standard practice in Roman legal proceedings. That was considered especially necessary in cases involving such grave religious offenses. The accused Vestal would be given an opportunity to defend herself. But the burden of proof was essentially reversed. She had to demonstrate her innocence, rather than having her guilt proven beyond doubt. The political dimensions of these trials cannot be overstated. Emperors and other powerful figures sometimes used accusations against Vestals as tools of political manipulation. During times of civil unrest or unpopular policies, a convenient Vestal scandal could redirect public attention and provide a religious explanation for the empire's troubles. Conversely, emperors might protect favored Vestals from accusations, demonstrating their own piety and authority over religious matters. One of the most notorious cases occurred during the reign of Emperor Domitian, a ruler known for his paranoia and cruelty. Multiple Vestal virgins were accused of unchastity during his reign, leading to a series of trials that were widely believed to be politically motivated. The emperor's use of these religious prosecutions to intimidate potential opponents and demonstrate his pious authority created a climate of fear that extended far beyond the house of the Vestals. The ritual of living death, when a Vestal virgin was found guilty of breaking her vow of chastity. The punishment that awaited her was unlike anything else in the Roman legal system. She would be buried alive, but not in the crude, hasty manner that the phrase might suggest. Instead, her execution was a carefully choreographed ritual that reflected both Roman legalism and religious sensibility. The condemned, Vestal, would be stripped of her religious ornaments and dressed in burial clothes. She would then be placed in a closed litter-covered sedan chair used for transportation and carried through the streets of Rome in a funeral procession. The procession was conducted in complete silence. No mourning cries or lamentations were permitted, as the city itself was considered to be in a state of religious pollution that could only be cleansed by the completion of the execution. The destination was a small underground chamber that had been prepared specifically for this purpose. This wasn't a simple hole in the ground, but a carefully constructed tomb, equipped with the minimal provisions necessary to maintain the legal fiction that the Vestal was not being directly killed by human hands. The chamber would contain a bed, a small lamp with oil, some bread, water, and a pitcher of milk, symbolic provisions for a journey into the underworld. The reasoning behind this elaborate ritual was rooted in Roman religious law, which held that it was sacrilegious to shed the blood of a Vestal virgin. These women had been consecrated to the goddess Vesta, and killing them directly would constitute murder of a sacred person, a crime that would bring divine retribution upon the entire city. By sealing them alive in an underground chamber with minimal provisions, the Romans believed they were allowing the gods themselves to determine the Vestal's fate. The condemned woman would be lowered into the chamber, and then the entrance would be sealed with earth and stones. Above ground, religious ceremonies would be performed to purify the city and restore its spiritual equilibrium. The Romans believed that if the Vestal was truly innocent, the gods would miraculously preserve her life. If she died, it proved her guilt and purified the city of contamination. Psychological and social dimensions of the punishment. The psychological horror of this punishment is difficult to overstate. Imagine the terror of being lowered into a dark, cramped underground chamber, hearing the sounds of earth and stones being piled above, knowing that you are being deliberately abandoned to die slowly in darkness and solitude. The condemned Vestal would face not just death, but the most prolonged and terrifying form of death imaginable: starvation, dehydration, and suffocation in complete isolation. But the horror extended beyond the physical suffering. For a Vestal virgin, whose entire adult life had been spent in positions of honor and respect, the shame and humiliation of such an accusation and punishment represented a complete inversion of everything she had known. These women had been revered as living goddesses, intermediaries between the human and divine realms. To fall from such heights to such depths represented not just personal tragedy, but a cosmic upheaval in the natural order. The psychological impact on Roman society as a whole was equally significant. The burial of a Vestal virgin was a traumatic event that reinforced multiple social messages simultaneously. It demonstrated the absolute power of the state over individual lives, the terrible consequences of sexual transgression, and the lengths to which Rome would go to maintain its relationship with the gods. For ordinary Romans, witnessing such an event would serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of maintaining social and religious order. For other Vestal virgins, each execution created an atmosphere of perpetual terror. Knowing that the slightest suspicion or political inconvenience could lead to such a fate must have created enormous psychological pressure. Some historians suggest that the stress of living under such conditions may have contributed to genuine mental health problems among the Vestals, creating behaviors that could be misinterpreted as evidence of guilt. The gender dynamics of this punishment were particularly significant in Roman society. While Roman men who committed sexual offenses might face various punishments, none approached the elaborate cruelty reserved for unchaste Vestals. This reflected broader Roman attitudes about female sexuality, which was seen as particularly dangerous and requiring strict control. The Vestal virgins represented an idealized vision of controlled female sexuality, powerful when properly channeled, but catastrophically destructive when allowed to run free. Historical cases and their contexts. Several specific cases of Vestal executions have been recorded by ancient historians, each providing insight into the political, social, and religious contexts that shaped these events. One of the most famous cases involved Cornelia, the chief Vestal during the reign of Emperor Domitian, accused of unchastity around 90 CE. Cornelia maintained her innocence even as she was being prepared for execution. According to the historian Pliny the Younger, who witnessed the events, Cornelia's trial was a masterpiece of imperial theatre. Domitian, seeking to demonstrate his piety and moral authority, personally presided over the proceedings. When the guilty verdict was announced, Cornelia reportedly cried out, "Does Caesar think I am unchaste, when he has conquered and triumphed through my prayers?" This defiant statement, suggesting that her sacred intercessions had helped secure Roman military victories, demonstrated both her courage and her understanding of the political dimensions of her persecution. The execution of Cornelia became a defining moment of Domitian's reign, illustrating both his power and his cruelty. Contemporary accounts describe the emperor's satisfaction with the proceedings, his attention to ritual details, and his use of the event to send messages to potential political opponents. The burial was conducted with full ceremonial pomp, transforming a judicial execution into a religious spectacle that reinforced imperial authority. Another significant case occurred during the reign of Emperor Caracalla in the early 3rd century. CE 3 Vestal virgins Aurelia, Severa, Pomponia, Rufina, and Canuscia Crescentino were simultaneously accused of unchastity. The mass accusations seemed suspicious to many contemporary observers, who noted that it conveniently occurred during a period of military defeats and economic troubles that had undermined the emperor's popularity. The trial of these three vestals became a sensation that gripped Roman society for months. Unlike earlier cases, where the accused had few defenders, these women came from powerful families that mounted sophisticated legal defenses. The proceedings revealed the complex intersection of law, politics, and religion in Roman society, as well as the growing skepticism among educated Romans about the traditional beliefs that justified such extreme punishments. Ultimately, 2 of the 3 were found guilty and executed, while the 3rd was acquitted under circumstances that many believed involved political compromise rather than evidence of innocence. The case highlighted the arbitrary nature of these prosecutions and contributed to growing doubts about the entire system of vestal punishment. The male accomplices, a different standard of justice, while the fate of unchaste vestal virgins was horrifyingly unique. Their supposed male partners faced a different, but still brutal form of execution. Roman law held that any man who seduced or raped a vestal virgin had committed one of the most serious crimes possible, not just against the individual woman, but against the state and the gods themselves. The standard punishment for men convicted of this crime was to be beaten to death with rods in the Roman Forum. This public execution served multiple purposes. It provided immediate, visible justice. It demonstrated that men as well as women faced severe consequences for violations of sacred law, and it created a spectacle that would be remembered and discussed throughout Roman society. However, the contrast between the male and female punishments is revealing. While the men faced swift, public death, the women endured prolonged, private suffering. The men's executions were straightforward acts of justice. The women's were elaborate rituals designed to maintain religious purity while inflicting maximum psychological torture. This difference reflected Roman beliefs about gender, sexuality, and spiritual contamination. In some cases, the men involved were of such high social status that alternative punishments were arranged. Wealthy or well-connected Romans might be allowed to go into exile rather than face execution, though this required significant political influence and often substantial bribes. The unequal application of justice based on social class was a consistent feature of Roman law, but it was particularly stark in cases involving religious crimes where the theoretical absolute nature of divine law conflicted with the practical realities of political power. The broader context, vestal virgins in Roman religion and society. To understand the extreme nature of the punishments inflicted on unchaste vestal virgins, it's essential to grasp their unique position in Roman religious and social life. The cult of Vesta was one of the oldest and most important religious institutions in Rome, predating even the legendary founding of the city by Romulus. The goddess Vesta was associated with the hearth, the sacred fire at the center of every Roman home that symbolized family, continuity, and divine protection. At the state level, Vesta's eternal flame represented the divine spark that kept Rome alive and prosperous. Romans believed that if this flame ever died, it would signal the end of their civilization. The responsibility for maintaining this flame fell to the Vestal Virgins, making them not just priestesses, but guardians of the empire's very existence. This enormous responsibility came with privileges that were unprecedented for women in Roman society. Vestal virgins were among the few women who could own property, make wills, and conduct business without male guardianship. They could testify in court without taking oaths, their word being considered absolutely trustworthy. They had reserved seats at public games and festivals, and their presence was considered essential at important state ceremonies. But these privileges existed within a framework of absolute control. The Vestals lived together in the house of the Vestals under strict supervision. Their daily lives were regulated by complex rules governing everything from their dress to their diet to their interactions with the outside world. They were expected to embody perfect virtue, not just in their sexual conduct, but in every aspect of their behavior. The selection and training of Vestal virgins reflected the importance Romans placed on their role. Candidates were chosen not just for their family connections, but for their physical perfection and presumed moral character. Once selected, they underwent years of training in the complex rituals associated with Vesta's worship, learning to tend the sacred flame, prepare sacred food offerings, and perform the numerous ceremonies that marked the Roman religious calendar. The evolution and decline of Vestal punishment. The practice of executing unchaste Vestal virgins evolved significantly over the centuries of Roman history. During the early Republic, such executions appear to have been relatively rare events that occurred only during periods of extreme crisis. As Rome grew in power and complexity, however, the political utility of Vestal trials became more apparent to ambitious politicians and paranoid emperors. During the imperial period, accusations against Vestal virgins became increasingly common and increasingly suspect. Emperors discovered that religious persecution could be an effective tool for demonstrating piety, eliminating political opponents, and distracting public attention from economic or military problems. The elaborate rituals surrounding Vestal executions provided perfect opportunities for imperial propaganda, allowing rulers to present themselves as guardians of traditional Roman values. This politicization of Vestal trials eventually contributed to their decline, as educated Romans became more skeptical of traditional religious beliefs and more aware of the political motivations behind these prosecutions. Public support for such extreme punishments began to wane. The rise of Christianity also played a significant role, as Christian emperors were less invested in maintaining traditional Roman religious practices. The last recorded execution of a Vestal virgin for unchastity occurred during the reign of Emperor Caracalla in the early 3rd century CE. By this time, the Roman Empire was facing numerous external and internal challenges that made the maintenance of traditional religious institutions increasingly difficult. The cult of Vesta continued to exist, but its political and social importance gradually diminished. The final blow came in 391 CE when Emperor Theodosius I, a devout Christian, ordered the extinguishing of the sacred flame and the dissolution of the Vestal order. This marked the end of more than 1,000 years of continuous religious practice and the final elimination of one of the most distinctive and disturbing aspects of Roman justice. Psychological and anthropological perspective. Scholars have approached the phenomenon of Vestal virgin punishment from various psychological and anthropological perspectives, seeking to understand not just what happened, but why such practices developed and persisted for so long. From an anthropological standpoint, the Vestal virgins can be understood as examples of what scholars call sacred specialists, individuals who are set apart from normal society to serve specific religious functions. Such specialists exist in many cultures and often face unusual restrictions and consequences that don't apply to ordinary people. The extreme punishment for unchaste Vestals can be seen as the dark side of their elevated status. The greater their honor and responsibility, the more severe the consequences of failure. The practice also reflects broader patterns in how human societies have regulated female sexuality. Cross-cultural studies suggest that societies often invest particular symbolic importance in the sexual behavior of specific categories of women, seeing their chastity or unchastity as connected to broader cosmic or social order. The Vestal virgins represented an extreme example of this pattern, where individual women's sexual behavior was believed to have consequences for the entire civilization. Psychologically, the punishment of burial alive represents one of the most sophisticated forms of torture ever devised. Unlike straightforward physical pain, which the body can sometimes accommodate or endure, the prospect of slow death in complete isolation attacks every human psychological vulnerability simultaneously. Fear of death, fear of confinement, fear of darkness, and fear of abandonment. The psychological impact on Roman society as a whole may have been even more significant than the immediate effect on the victims. The knowledge that such punishments existed and could be applied created what psychologists call ambient anxiety, a constant, low-level fear that influenced behavior even when no immediate threat was present. For women in particular, the fate of the Vestal Virgins served as an extreme example of the consequences of sexual transgression, reinforcing social norms through spectacular terror, literary and cultural impact. The dramatic nature of Vestal Virgin punishments captured the imagination of ancient writers and has continued to fascinate artists, writers, and scholars throughout history. Ancient historians like Livy, Tacitus, and Pliny the Younger provided detailed accounts of specific cases that combined historical documentation with moral commentary and political analysis. These accounts often reveal more about their authors' perspectives than about the actual events they describe. Roman historians typically presented Vestal executions as either tragic examples of divine justice or horrifying illustrations of imperial cruelty, depending on their political viewpoints and the reputations of the emperors involved. The theme of the unchaste Vestal has appeared repeatedly in Western literature, from medieval morality tales to Renaissance dramas to modern novels. These works have typically focused on the personal tragedy of individual women caught between desire and duty, often presenting them as victims of cruel and arbitrary religious laws, rather than as actual criminals deserving punishment. Modern feminist scholars have particularly focused on the Vestal Virgin phenomenon as an example of how patriarchal societies use the threat of extreme violence to control female sexuality. From this perspective, the elaborate rituals surrounding Vestal punishment represent the institutionalization of male fear about uncontrolled female power and sexuality. However, some scholars have argued for more nuanced interpretations that recognize the genuine power and privilege that Vestal virgins enjoyed within Roman society. While their punishment for unchastity was horrific, their position when they maintained their vows was unique in giving women authority and independence that was otherwise impossible in the ancient world. Chapter 2. Pona Kalei, Death in a Sack with Bestial Companions. Ultimate taboo. Patricide. In Roman society, in the complex moral landscape of ancient Rome, where honor, family, and tradition formed the bedrock of society, no crime was considered more heinous than patricide, the murder of one's father. This wasn't merely viewed as homicide, it was seen as an assault on the very foundations of Roman civilization, a cosmic violation that demanded not just punishment, but cosmic retribution. The Romans developed a punishment so bizarre, so symbolically complex, and so psychologically horrifying that it stands as perhaps the most creative form of execution in human history. Pona Kalei, or the penalty of the sack. To understand why the Romans viewed patricide with such horror, we must first understand the central role of the paterfamilias in Roman society. The Roman family was not merely a social unit, but a religious, economic, and political institution. At its head stood the paterfamilias, the oldest male ancestor, who wielded absolute authority over every member of his household. This authority, known as patria potestas, was so complete that it included the legal right to kill any member of his family, including adult children. The paterfamilias was more than just a family head. He was a priest responsible for maintaining the family's relationship with the gods, a judge who settled disputes within the household, and an economic manager who controlled all family property. His authority was considered divinely ordained, making an attack upon him not just a personal crime but a religious sacrilege that threatened the cosmic order itself. When a son killed his father, he wasn't just committing murder, he was in the natural hierarchy that the Romans believed was established by the gods themselves. Such an act was thought to contaminate not just the individual criminal, but potentially the entire community. The very word patricide carried connotations of unnatural wickedness that went beyond ordinary criminality into the realm of cosmic horror. The Roman historian Cicero described patricide as the most impious of all crimes, while other writers compared patricidal sons to monsters or demons. Legal texts referred to such criminals as parricides, a term that encompassed not just the killing of fathers, but any murder of close family members, though father killing remained the most serious variant. The symbolic architecture of punishment devised for patricides was as complex symbolically as it was cruel practically. Pona wasn't simply an execution method. It was an elaborate ritual designed to reflect the cosmic nature of the crime and to restore the natural order that had been violated. Every element of the punishment carried specific symbolic meaning that would have been immediately apparent to Roman observers. The process began with the preparation of a large leather sack, typically made from the hide of an ox or bull. This wasn't arbitrary. The choice of leather reflected Roman beliefs about purification and transformation. Leather, having been processed from animal skin, represented a boundary between life and death, making it symbolically appropriate for containing someone who had violated the natural boundaries of family loyalty. Into this sack, along with the condemned patricide, were placed for animals: a dog, a serpent, a monkey, and a rooster. Modern observers might assume these animals were chosen randomly or simply for their capacity to create chaos and suffering. But Roman sources suggest each had specific symbolic significance that related to the patricide's crimes against nature and society. The dog represented loyalty and faithfulness, qualities that the patricide had betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. Dogs were sacred to several Roman deities and were commonly used in religious ceremonies involving purification and protection. By forcing the criminal to share his final moments with a loyal dog, the Romans were creating a living allegory of the loyalty he had abandoned. The serpent symbolized deceit, treachery, and hidden evil. In Roman mythology, serpents were associated with the underworld and with transformation, often sinister transformation. The snake in the sack represented the hidden, poisonous nature that had led the patricide to commit his unnatural crime. The monkey was chosen to represent the chaos and disorder that resulted from violating natural law. Monkeys were seen by Romans as grotesque parodies of human beings, creatures that mimicked human behavior but lacked human reasoning and morality. Including a monkey in the sack suggested that the patricide had descended from human to bestial status through his crimes. The rooster represented vigilance, and the dawn symbolizing the watchfulness that the patricide should have shown toward his father's welfare and the new day that his crime had made impossible. Roosters were also associated with Mars, the god of war, suggesting that the patricide had waged impious war against his own family. The ritual process of execution, the execution of a patricide through Pona, was not a hurried affair, but an elaborate public ceremony that could take hours or even days to complete. The process began in the Roman Forum, or another public space where large crowds could gather to witness this demonstration of divine justice. The condemned patricide would first be brought before the assembled crowd in chains, typically wearing a special hood or mask that marked him as someone who had committed crimes against nature. Roman sources describe these masks as being designed to dehumanize the wearer, often featuring grotesque or animal-like features that suggested the patricide's descent from human to bestial status. Before the actual execution, the patricide would typically be subjected to preliminary punishments designed to demonstrate the severity of his crimes. These might include public whipping, the application of hot iron brands, or other forms of torture that were intended not just to cause pain but to begin the process of stripping away the criminal's human dignity. The preparation of the sack itself was conducted with ritual care. Priests would oversee the process, ensuring that each animal was placed in the sack according to proper religious protocols. The animals were typically not harmed before being placed in the sack. The Romans wanted them to be alive and active when the execution began, maximizing both the chaos inside the sack and the symbolic impact of the punishment. Once the patricide was sewn into the sack with his animal companions, the entire bundle would be transported to a body of water, typically the Tiber River in Rome itself, though other locations were used in the provinces. The choice of water for the final disposal was symbolically significant. Rivers represented purification and renewal, and the Romans believed that drowning the patricide would cleanse the community of the contamination his crime had created. The sack would be loaded onto a boat and taken to a deep part of the river, where it would be thrown overboard with great ceremony. Roman accounts describe the crowd cheering as the sack hit the water and then watching in fascination and horror as it sank, often with visible movement from within as the trapped occupants struggled against their fate. The experience of the condemned. We can never know exactly what the final moments of a patricide condemned to Pona were like. Roman sources provide enough detail to reconstruct the likely experience with disturbing clarity. The psychological horror began long before the physical suffering. Starting from the moment the sentence was pronounced, the condemned man would have days or weeks to contemplate his fate while awaiting execution. Roman prisons were not designed for long-term incarceration, but rather for holding prisoners awaiting trial or punishment, and conditions were deliberately harsh. The patricide would be kept in chains in a dark, cramped cell, probably underground, with minimal food and water. Guards and fellow prisoners would know the nature of his crime and would likely treat him with a mixture of fear and disgust that reflected broader social attitudes toward patricides. During this waiting period, the condemned man might be visited by family members, though Roman law prohibited anyone from attempting to help him escape his fate. These visits were often described as deeply traumatic for all involved, as the patricide's crime had typically shattered his entire family structure and left surviving relatives struggling with shame, grief, and divided loyalties. As the execution day approached, the patricide would be brought from his cell and prepared for the ceremony. This preparation involved ritual purification, not to cleanse him for a religious purpose, but to ensure that his contamination would not spread to others involved in the execution. He would be stripped, washed, and dressed in simple clothes that could be easily removed when the time came to place him in the sack. The moment of being sewn into the sack with the 4 animals would have been psychologically catastrophic. The condemned man would find himself in complete darkness, pressed against the leather walls of his mobile prison, with 4 frightened and increasingly agitated animals as his only companions. The dog might bark or whine. The rooster would likely crow and flap its wings. The monkey would screech and possibly try to climb on the human occupant, and the serpent would slither unpredictably through the confined space. The sensory experience would have been overwhelming. The sounds of panicked animals, the smell of fear and animal waste, the feeling of claws, teeth, and scales against skin, all in a space too small for any of the occupants to move freely. The psychological impact of being trapped with creatures that represented his own moral failures would have added layers of mental anguish to the physical suffering. The final journey to the water would bring a new form of terror. The knowledge that death was imminent, combined with the uncertainty of exactly when and how it would come. The patricide would feel the sack being lifted, carried, and placed in a boat, then endured the rocking motion of travel across the water while remaining trapped with his increasingly frantic animal companions. The moment of being thrown into the water would bring the ultimate horror. The sack would sink quickly, pulled down by the weight of its occupants, and the patricide would face simultaneous threats from drowning, animal attacks, and the crushing weight of water above. Death might come from any combination of these factors: suffocation, drowning, injury from panicked animals, or simply shock from the overwhelming sensory assault. Political and legal dimensions. While Ponacole was theoretically reserved for the crime of patricide, the reality of its application was far more complex and politically charged. Roman law made distinctions between different types of family killing, and the definition of patricide could be manipulated for political purposes by ambitious prosecutors or vengeful emperors. The legal framework surrounding patricide evolved significantly over the centuries of Roman history. During the early Republic, cases of father killing were relatively rare and were typically handled by family councils rather than public courts. As Roman society became more complex and urban, however, the traditional family structures that had prevented such crimes began to break down, and patricide cases became more common. The development of formal legal procedures for prosecuting patricides reflected broader changes in Roman law and society. During the imperial period, emperors increasingly involved themselves in high-profile patricide cases, using them as opportunities to demonstrate their commitment to traditional moral values and their authority over life and death. Some cases became major political events that divided Roman society along factional lines. Wealthy or well-connected defendants could sometimes avoid the full severity of Ponacole through legal maneuvering, bribery, or imperial intervention, leading to public controversies about the equal application of justice. The punishment was also sometimes applied to crimes other than literal father killing. Roman law eventually expanded the definition of parricide to include the killing of other close relatives, and in some cases, the murder of emperors or other authority figures was treated as a form of metaphorical patricide that deserved similar punishment. documented cases and historical examples, while Ponakale was more often threatened than actually carried out. Several documented cases provide insight into how the punishment was applied in practice. One of the most famous cases occurred during the reign of Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century CE, when a young nobleman named Marcus Pontius was accused of poisoning his father to inherit the family fortune early. The case became a sensation throughout the Roman Empire, not just because of the wealth and social prominence of the family involved, but because of the defendant's youth and the complex web of family politics that surrounded the crime. Marcus was only 19 when his father died under suspicious circumstances, and initial investigations suggested that the death might have been natural. However, when slaves in the household were tortured for information, a standard legal procedure revealed evidence of a sophisticated poisoning plot. The trial took place in Rome with Emperor Hadrian himself presiding. Demonstrating the political importance attached to the case, the prosecution presented evidence that Marcus had obtained rare poisons from Egyptian merchants, had been overheard discussing his father's death before it occurred, and had immediately begun making plans to dispose of family property that would have required his father's consent. Marcus's defense team argued that the slave testimony was unreliable due to torture, that the alleged poison could not be definitively detected in the father's remains, and that the young man's actions after his father's death were consistent with normal grief and inheritance procedures. They also pointed to Marcus's previously good relationship with his father and his lack of any pressing financial need that would have motivated the crime. Despite these arguments, the weight of evidence and the political pressure for a conviction led to Marcus being found guilty of patricide. The sentence of Ponakale was pronounced with full ceremonial gravity, and preparations began for what would be one of the most elaborate executions of the imperial period. However, this case also illustrates the political complexities surrounding such punishments. Marcus's family had significant political connections and considerable wealth, which they used to lobby for imperial clemency. After several weeks of legal maneuvering and private negotiations, Emperor Hadrian commuted the sentence to exile and the confiscation of most of the family property. This commutation created considerable controversy among Roman legal scholars and the general public. Some praised the emperor's mercy and wisdom, arguing that the evidence against Marcus had not been entirely conclusive and that execution would have been excessive. Others condemned the decision as an example of how wealth and political connections could overcome even the most sacred principles of Roman justice. The case had lasting effects on Roman legal practice, leading to new procedures for investigating potential patricide cases and establishing precedents for imperial intervention in capital punishment cases. It also contributed to ongoing debates about the appropriate relationship between traditional religious law and the practical needs of imperial governance. Another significant case occurred during the chaotic 3rd century CE, when the Roman Empire was facing multiple military and political crises. A soldier named Gaius Brutus was accused of killing his father, a retired centurion, during a dispute over the father's refusal to provide money for gambling debts. Unlike the complex Marcus Pontius case, the evidence against Gaius Brutus was overwhelming and undisputed. Multiple witnesses had seen him strike his father with a sword during a public argument in a tavern, and the father died of his wounds within hours. The crime occurred in front of dozens of people, including other soldiers who were horrified by such a violation of military discipline and family honor. The military context of this case added additional layers of significance. Roman military culture placed enormous emphasis on discipline, hierarchy, and respect for authority, making a soldier's murder of his father particularly shocking to military audiences. The case was tried by a military tribunal rather than civilian courts, reflecting the military's determination to handle the matter within their own justice system. The sentence of Ponakale was carried out with full military ceremony, including participation by the defendant's former comrades who were required to witness the execution as a lesson in proper military conduct. Contemporary accounts describe the profound impact this execution had on military morale and discipline, as soldiers throughout the empire learned of the fate that awaited those who violated the most basic principles of Roman military and family honor. Variations and regional adaptations. As the Roman Empire expanded to encompass diverse territories and cultures, the application of Ponakale sometimes varied according to local conditions and customs. While the basic elements of the punishment remained consistency and the condemned into a sack with animals and drowning the entire package, practical considerations sometimes required modifications. In regions where large bodies of water were not readily available, alternative disposal methods were sometimes used. In desert provinces, the sack might be buried in sand or left exposed to die of dehydration and heat. In mountainous areas, the sack might be thrown from high cliffs rather than into water. These variations maintained the essential symbolic elements of the punishment while adapting to local geographical constraints. Different provinces also sometimes varied the animals included in the sack based on local availability and religious traditions, while the standard combination of dog, snake, monkey, and rooster was preferred. Regions where some of these animals were rare might substitute others with similar symbolic significance. For example, in some northern provinces where monkeys were unknown, bears or wolves might be used instead. The integration of pona kole with local legal traditions created interesting hybrid practices in some provinces. In Egypt, where traditional religious practices involving sacred animals remained strong, the inclusion of certain creatures in execution sacks was considered sacrilegious, leading to modifications that respected local sensibilities while maintaining Roman legal principles. These regional variations also reflected the practical challenges of maintaining complex execution rituals across a vast empire with limited communication and transportation systems. Local Roman governors had considerable discretion in how they implemented imperial legal directives, and this discretion often led to creative adaptations of standard procedures. The psychological impact on Roman society. The existence of pona kole as a potential punishment had effects on Roman society that extended far beyond the relatively few cases where it was actually implemented. The knowledge that such a fate awaited patricides served as a powerful deterrent that reinforced family structures and social hierarchies throughout the empire. Roman fathers could invoke the threat of pona kole when disciplining adult sons, knowing that even the most rebellious young men would be sobered by the thought of such a death. This gave the paterfamilias additional authority in family disputes and helped maintain the traditional Roman family structure even as broader social changes challenged patriarchal authority. The punishment also served broader social functions by providing a concrete example of what happened to those who violated fundamental social norms. In a society where most people lived in extended family groups and where family loyalty was considered essential to social stability, the specter of pona kole reminded everyone of the catastrophic consequences of family betrayal. The public nature of patricide executions made them powerful teaching tools that reinforced Roman values across all social classes. Rich and poor alike could witness the fate that awaited those who committed the ultimate family crime, creating shared experiences that unified diverse populations under Roman legal and moral authority. The psychological impact was particularly strong on young Roman men who faced the complex challenge of establishing their own identities and authority while remaining subordinate to their fathers. The existence of pona kole provided a dramatic reminder of the limits of acceptable rebellion against paternal authority, channeling youthful aggression into more socially acceptable outlets like military service or political competition. Literary and artistic representations. The dramatic and symbolic nature of pona kole captured the imagination of Roman writers, who used it as a subject for poetry, drama, and moral instruction. The punishment appeared in various forms of Roman literature, from legal treatises that discussed its technical application to epic poems that used it as a symbol of divine justice. The Roman poet Juvenal referenced pona kole in his satirical works, using it as an example of the extreme measures that Roman civilization took to maintain moral order. His descriptions emphasized both the horror and the justice of the punishment, presenting it as evidence of Rome's commitment to fundamental moral principles even when applying them required shocking brutality. Roman historians like Livy and Tacitus included detailed descriptions of patricide cases and their punishments in their chronicles, using these events to illustrate broader themes about Roman character, justice, and social change. Their accounts often focused on the moral and political dimensions of specific cases, showing how individual crimes reflected larger social tensions and transformations. The punishment also appeared in Roman drama, where it served as a powerful symbol of fate and justice. Playwrights used the threat or reality of pono kole to create dramatic tension and to explore themes of family loyalty, moral responsibility, and the consequences of violating natural law. These literary treatments of pono kole helped spread knowledge of the punishment throughout Roman society and beyond, ensuring that even people who never witnessed an actual execution would understand its significance and symbolic meaning. They also contributed to the punishment's psychological impact by keeping it present in popular consciousness even during periods when it was rarely implemented. The decline and abolition of pono kole as Roman society evolved, and as Christian influences became more prominent in the later empire, attitudes toward pono kole began to change. The rise of Christianity brought new perspectives on justice, mercy, and the treatment of criminals that were often at odds with traditional Roman practices. Christian writers criticized pono kole as an example of pagan cruelty that was incompatible with Christian teachings about forgiveness and redemption. They argued that the elaborate symbolic elements of the punishment reflected superstitious beliefs that had no place in a Christian society, and that even the worst criminals deserved the opportunity for repentance and salvation. The practical difficulties of maintaining such complex execution rituals also contributed to the decline of pono kole. As the Roman Empire faced increasing military and economic pressures, resources that might have been devoted to elaborate ceremonies were redirected to more pressing needs. Local governors found it easier and cheaper to execute patricides through simpler methods like beheading or crucifixion. Legal scholars in the later empire also began questioning whether pono kole was consistent with evolving Roman legal principles that emphasized proportionality and due process. The symbolic and religious dimensions of the punishment seemed increasingly archaic to jurists who were developing more systematic approaches to criminal law. The formal abolition of pono kole is difficult to date, precisely as it appears to have fallen into disuse gradually rather than being officially banned at a specific moment. The last clearly documented case occurred in the 4th century CE, during the reign of Constantine, who was himself a Christian convert with little sympathy for traditional Roman religious practices. By the time of the final division of the Roman Empire in the late 4th century, pono kole had effectively disappeared from legal practice, though knowledge of it persisted in legal texts and historical accounts. The punishment remained a powerful symbol of ancient Roman justice long after it ceased to be a practical reality. Modern perspectives and analysis. Contemporary scholars have approached pono kole from various disciplinary perspectives, seeking to understand not just what the punishment involved, but what it reveals about Roman society, psychology, and culture. Anthropologists have noted similarities between pono kole and ritual practices in other cultures that use symbolic elements to restore cosmic order after serious transgressions. Legal historians have analyzed pono kole as an example of how ancient legal systems combined practical deterrence with symbolic and religious functions. They note that the punishment's elaborate ritual elements served purposes that went beyond simple retribution, helping to maintain social cohesion and cultural identity in a diverse empire. Psychologists have studied pono kole as an example of how societies use extreme punishments to address fundamental anxieties about family structure and social order. The punishment's focus on patricide, ultimate family crimes, suggests deep-seated concerns about maintaining intergenerational authority and preventing the breakdown of basic social institutions. Historians of religion have examined the symbolic elements of pono kole as evidence of Roman beliefs about contamination, purification, and the relationship between human actions and cosmic order. The inclusion of specific animals in the execution reflects complex religious ideas about the natural world and humanity's place within it. Modern human rights advocates have cited pono kole as an example of why contemporary legal systems emphasize proportionality and human dignity in punishment. The extreme and deliberately dehumanizing nature of the punishment serves as a reminder of how far human civilization has progressed in its understanding of justice and mercy. Chapter 3. Crucifixion. Inverted when death became performance. Arthur cross as symbol and instrument. Crucifixion stands as perhaps the most iconic form of execution in human history, forever associated in Western consciousness with the death of Jesus Christ and the foundations of Christianity. However, long before it became a religious symbol, crucifixion was Rome's preferred method for executing slaves. rebels, and criminals of the lowest social classes. It was a punishment designed not merely to kill, but to humiliate, to terrorize, and to serve as a public warning to anyone who might consider challenging Roman authority. The Romans did not invent crucifixion. Archaeological evidence suggests that various forms of death by suspension existed in Assyria, Persia, and other ancient civilizations. However, the Romans perfected it, systematized it, and used it on such a massive scale that it became synonymous with Roman power and Roman cruelty. They transformed what had been a relatively crude method of execution into an elaborate, standardized procedure that could accommodate hundreds or even thousands of victims simultaneously. The basic form of Roman crucifixion involved nailing or tying the condemned person to a wooden structure, typically a vertical post with a horizontal crossbeam. Though various configurations were used depending on circumstances and the imagination of the executioners, the victim would be left to die slowly over a period of hours or days, suffering from a combination of factors including blood loss, shock, dehydration, and ultimately respiratory failure, as the body's position made breathing increasingly difficult. But the physical suffering, horrible as it was, represented only one dimension of crucifixion's purpose. The punishment was deliberately public, typically carried out along major roads where maximum numbers of people would witness the spectacle. The crosses were often left standing for days or weeks after the victims' deaths, serving as rotting reminders of Roman power and the consequences of defying it. The Romans developed numerous variations of the basic crucifixion method, adapting the punishment to reflect the specific nature of crimes, the social status of victims, or simply the creative sadism of particular executioners. Victims might be nailed or tied to their crosses, positioned upright or at various angles, or subjected to additional tortures before, during, or after the actual crucifixion process. The inverted cross, symbolism and suffering among the various modifications that Roman executioners developed. None was more psychologically and symbolically powerful than inverted crucifixion, executing victims head down rather than in the standard upright position. This variation transformed an already horrific death into something even more degrading and agonizing, while adding layers of symbolic meaning that would have been immediately apparent to ancient observers. The decision to crucify someone up was never arbitrary. It represented a deliberate choice to maximize suffering, humiliation, and symbolic impact. The inverted position created additional medical complications that hastened death while simultaneously making the dying process more agonizing. Blood would rush to the victim's head, causing severe headaches, disorientation, and eventually unconsciousness. The unusual positioning of the body created strain on muscles and joints that were not designed to support weight in that configuration. From a symbolic perspective, inversion represented a complete reversal of the natural order, a fitting punishment for those who had violated social, religious, or political norms. In Roman thinking, criminals had already turned themselves upside down morally by their crimes. Inverted crucifixion made this moral inversion physically manifest. The practice also reflected Roman beliefs about hierarchy and status. While ordinary crucifixion was considered appropriate for slaves and common criminals, inverted crucifixion was often reserved for those who had committed particularly heinous crimes or who had held positions of authority that they had betrayed. The inversion served to emphasize the completeness of their fall from grace. Religious dimensions were also significant. In Roman polytheistic belief systems, the relationship between heaven and earth, gods and mortals, was conceived in terms of vertical hierarchy. By inverting crucifixion victims, executioners were symbolically cutting them off from any possibility of divine intervention or posthumous honor, literally turning them away from the heavens. The punishment also appeared in Roman drama, where it served as a powerful symbol of fate and justice. Playwrights used the threat or reality of pono kale to create dramatic tension and to explore themes of family loyalty, moral responsibility, and the consequences of violating natural law. These literary treatments of pono kale helped spread knowledge of the punishment throughout Roman society and beyond, ensuring that even people who never witnessed an actual execution would understand its significance and symbolic meaning. They also contributed to the punishment's psychological impact by keeping it present in popular consciousness even during periods when it was rarely implemented. The decline and abolition of pono kale as Roman society evolved, and as Christian influences became more prominent in the later empire. Attitudes toward Ponakale began to change. The rise of Christianity brought new perspectives on justice, mercy, and the treatment of criminals that were often at odds with traditional Roman practices. Christian writers criticized Ponakale as an example of pagan cruelty that was incompatible with Christian teachings about forgiveness and redemption. They argued that the elaborate symbolic elements of the punishment reflected superstitious beliefs that had no place in a Christian society, and that even the worst criminals deserved the opportunity for repentance and salvation. The practical difficulties of maintaining such complex execution rituals also contributed to the decline of Ponakale. As the Roman Empire faced increasing military and economic pressures, resources that might have been devoted to elaborate ceremonies were redirected to more pressing needs. Local governors found it easier and cheaper to execute patricides through simpler methods like beheading or crucifixion. Legal scholars in the later empire also began questioning whether Ponakale was consistent with evolving Roman legal principles that emphasized proportionality and due process. The symbolic and religious dimensions of the punishment seemed increasingly archaic to jurists who were developing more systematic approaches to criminal law. The formal abolition of Ponakale is difficult to date, precisely as it appears to have fallen into disuse gradually rather than being officially banned at a specific moment. The last clearly documented case occurred in the 4th century CE, during the reign of Constantine, who was himself a Christian convert with little sympathy for traditional Roman religious practices. By the time of the final division of the Roman Empire in the late 4th century, Ponakale had effectively disappeared from legal practice, though knowledge of it persisted in legal texts and historical accounts. The punishment remained a powerful symbol of ancient Roman justice long after it ceased to be a practical reality. Modern perspectives and analysis. Contemporary scholars have approached Ponakale from various disciplinary perspectives, seeking to understand not just what the punishment involved, but what it reveals about Roman society, psychology, and culture. Anthropologists have noted similarities between Ponakale and ritual practices in other cultures that use symbolic elements to restore cosmic order after serious transgressions. Legal historians have analyzed Ponakale as an example of how ancient legal systems combined practical deterrence with symbolic and religious functions. They note that the punishment's elaborate ritual elements served purposes that went beyond simple retribution, helping to maintain social cohesion and cultural identity in a diverse empire. Psychologists have studied Ponakale as an example of how societies use extreme punishments to address fundamental anxieties about family structure and social order. The punishment's focus on patricide, ultimate family crimes, suggests deep-seated concerns about maintaining intergenerational authority and preventing the breakdown of basic social institutions. Historians of religion have examined the symbolic elements of Ponakale as evidence of Roman beliefs about contamination, purification, and the relationship between human actions and cosmic order. The inclusion of specific animals in the execution reflects complex religious ideas about the natural world and humanity's place within it. Modern human rights advocates have cited Ponakale as an example of why contemporary legal systems emphasize proportionality and human dignity in punishment. The extreme and deliberately dehumanizing nature of the punishment serves as a reminder of how far human civilization has progressed in its understanding of justice and mercy. Chapter 3. Crucifixion. Inverted when death became performance. Arthur cross as symbol and instrument. Crucifixion stands as perhaps the most iconic form of execution in human history, forever associated in Western consciousness with the death of Jesus Christ and the foundations of Christianity. However, long before it became a religious symbol, crucifixion was Rome's preferred method for executing slaves, rebels, and criminals of the lowest social classes. It was a punishment designed not merely to kill, but to humiliate, to terrorize, and to serve as a public warning to anyone who might consider challenging Roman authority. The Romans did not invent crucifixion. Archaeological evidence suggests that various forms of death by suspension existed in Assyria, Persia, and other ancient civilizations. However, the Romans perfected it, systematized it, and used it on such a massive scale that it became synonymous with Roman power and Roman cruelty. They transformed what had been a relatively crude method of execution into an elaborate, standardized procedure that could accommodate hundreds or even thousands of victims simultaneously. The basic form of Roman crucifixion involved nailing or tying the condemned person to a wooden structure, typically a vertical post with a horizontal crossbeam, though various configurations were used depending on circumstances and the imagination of the executioners. The victim would be left to die slowly over a period of hours or days, suffering from a combination of factors including blood loss, shock, dehydration, and ultimately respiratory failure, as the body's position made breathing increasingly difficult. But the physical suffering, horrible as it was, represented only one dimension of crucifixion's purpose. The punishment was deliberately public, typically carried out along major roads where maximum numbers of people would witness the spectacle. The crosses were often left standing for days or weeks after the victims' deaths, serving as rotting reminders of Roman power and the consequences of defying it. The Romans developed numerous variations of the basic crucifixion method, adapting the punishment to reflect the specific nature of crimes, the social status of victims, or simply the creative sadism of particular executioners. Victims might be nailed or tied to their crosses, positioned upright or at various angles, or subjected to additional tortures before, during, or after the actual crucifixion process. The inverted cross, symbolism and suffering among the various modifications that Roman executioners developed. None was more psychologically and symbolically powerful than inverted crucifixion, executing victims head down rather than in the standard upright position. This variation transformed an already horrific death into something even more degrading and agonizing, while adding layers of symbolic meaning that would have been immediately apparent to ancient observers. The decision to crucify someone up was never arbitrary. It represented a deliberate choice to maximize suffering, humiliation, and symbolic impact. The inverted position created additional medical complications that hastened death, while simultaneously making the dying process more agonizing. Blood would rush to the victim's head, causing severe headaches, disorientation, and eventually unconsciousness. The unusual positioning of the body created strain on muscles and joints that were not designed to support weight in that configuration. From a symbolic perspective, inversion represented a complete reversal of the natural order, a fitting punishment for those who had violated social, religious, or political norms. In Roman thinking, criminals had already turned themselves upside down morally by their crimes. Inverted crucifixion made this moral inversion physically manifest. The practice also reflected Roman beliefs about hierarchy and status. While ordinary crucifixion was considered appropriate for slaves and common criminals, inverted crucifixion was often reserved for those who had committed particularly heinous crimes or who had held positions of authority that they had betrayed. The inversion served to emphasize the completeness of their fall from grace. Religious dimensions were also significant. In Roman polytheistic belief systems, the relationship between heaven and earth, gods and mortals, was conceived in terms of vertical hierarchy. By inverting crucifixion victims, executioners were symbolically cutting them off from any possibility of divine intervention or posthumous honor, literally turning them away from the heavens. Roman executioners became skilled at adjusting the height and angle of inverted crucifixions to maximize visibility and psychological impact. Victims might be positioned at various heights depending on the terrain and the desired effect, with some inverted crucifixions placing the victim's head at eye level with observers for maximum dramatic impact. The timing of inverted crucifixions also required careful consideration, since death typically came faster than in upright crucifixion. Executioners might delay the final positioning or use other techniques to prolong the dying process when extended suffering was desired for deterrent purposes. Psychological warfare and deterrent effects. The primary purpose of crucifixion, whether upright or inverted, was not simply execution but psychological warfare against potential enemies of the Roman state. Inverted crucifixion served this purpose with particular effectiveness due to its unusual visual impact and the additional layers of symbolism it conveyed. The sight of inverted crucifixion victims created profound psychological impressions on observers that differed qualitatively from reactions to standard crucifixions. The unnatural positioning challenged viewers' basic assumptions about proper death and burial, creating feelings of unease and revulsion that extended beyond normal responses to violence. For potential rebels or criminals, The threat of inverted crucifixion represented an escalation beyond ordinary execution that suggested both the seriousness of their crimes and the creativity of Roman revenge. The knowledge that Roman authorities were willing and able to devise increasingly elaborate forms of suffering served as a powerful deterrent to organized resistance. The symbolic dimensions of inversion also conveyed specific messages about social order and hierarchy. By literally turning criminals upside down, Romans demonstrated their power to reverse any attempt to overturn established authority. The message was clear: those who tried to turn society upside down would themselves be inverted and destroyed. Religious and cultural groups that observed inverted crucifixions would have understood the symbolic significance within their own belief systems. For polytheistic Romans, the inversion suggested divine abandonment and cosmic displeasure. For Christians, it became associated with humility and sacrifice. For other religious groups, it might carry different but equally powerful symbolic meanings. The long-term psychological effects of witnessing inverted crucifixions extended beyond immediate deterrence to shape cultural attitudes about authority, rebellion, and punishment. Communities that had experienced such events would carry collective memories that influenced behavior for generations, creating lasting effects that far exceeded the immediate impact on individual victims. Artistic and literary representations. Dramatic visual impact of inverted crucifixion made it a powerful subject for ancient and medieval artists, who used it to convey themes of martyrdom, sacrifice, divine justice, and political power. Early Christian art often depicted the crucifixion of St. Peter as a way of honoring apostolic sacrifice, while simultaneously criticizing Roman cruelty. Roman artists and writers occasionally included references to inverted crucifixion in works designed to demonstrate imperial power or to warn against rebellion. These representations typically emphasized the completeness of the criminal's defeat and the thoroughness of Roman justice, using the visual symbolism of inversion to reinforce messages about political and social order. Medieval Christian art developed sophisticated iconographic traditions around the inverted cross, transforming what had originally been a symbol of Roman cruelty into a representation of apostolic authority and spiritual humility. This transformation demonstrates how cultural meanings can evolve dramatically over time, with the same visual symbol conveying opposite messages in different historical contexts. Literary treatments of inverted crucifixion often focused on the psychological and spiritual dimensions of the experience rather than just the physical suffering. Writers used the inversion as a metaphor for moral and spiritual transformation, exploring themes of redemption, sacrifice, and the relationship between earthly and divine justice. The persistence of inverted crucifixion imagery in various cultural contexts demonstrates its continued power to evoke strong emotional and psychological responses. Even in modern times, the inverted cross remains a potent symbol that can convey meanings ranging from Christian humility to anti-religious rebellion, depending on the context in which it appears. Evolution and transformation of meaning. The historical trajectory of inverted crucifixion illustrates how the meaning and significance of punishment methods can evolve dramatically over time. What began as a Roman technique for maximizing suffering and humiliation was transformed by Christian interpretation into a symbol of spiritual devotion and apostolic authority. This transformation was not accidental but reflected deliberate efforts by early Christian communities to reclaim and reinterpret symbols of Roman oppression. By presenting Peter's inverted crucifixion as an act of voluntary humility rather than imposed cruelty, Christians transformed a symbol of defeat into one of spiritual victory. The process of meaning transformation continued throughout the medieval period, as Christian theology developed increasingly sophisticated interpretations of martyrdom and sacrifice. The inverted cross became associated not just with Peter's individual sacrifice, but with the broader Christian understanding of how suffering could be transformed into spiritual triumph. However, the symbol's evolution was not unidirectional. In later periods, anti-Christian movements would reclaim the inverted cross as a symbol of rebellion against religious authority, demonstrating how symbols can be repeatedly reinterpreted by different groups for their own purposes. The modern usage of inverted cross symbolism in various contexts, from heavy metal music to horror films to religious art, shows how ancient punishment methods can continue to influence contemporary culture in unexpected ways. The power to evoke strong emotional responses remains, even when the original historical context has been largely forgotten. Understanding this evolution of meaning helps illuminate how societies process traumatic historical experiences and transform them into manageable cultural symbols. The journey of inverted crucifixion, from Roman punishment tool to Christian symbol to modern cultural icon, demonstrates the remarkable adaptability of human meaning-making in the face of extreme experiences. Chapter 4. Decimation. The mathematics of military terror. The origins of ultimate military discipline. In the brutal calculus of Roman military discipline, few practices demonstrate the empire's commitment to order and obedience more starkly than decimation. This punishment, whose name literally means removal of a tenth, represented the ultimate fusion of mathematical precision and psychological terror, creating a system where collective failure was addressed through carefully administered collective punishment that turned soldiers into executioners of their own comrades. The practice of decimation emerged from the unique challenges facing Roman military commanders, who needed to maintain discipline among large armies composed of diverse populations, many of whom had been forcibly conscripted or recruited from recently conquered territories. Traditional military punishments, flogging, demotion, extra duties, proved inadequate when entire units displayed cowardice, attempted desertion, or engaged in mutiny. Decimation provided a solution that was both mathematically fair and psychologically devastating. The logic behind decimation was coldly rational. If an entire unit failed in its duties, executing everyone would waste valuable military resources and potentially cripple the army's fighting capacity. Executing no one would send the message that collective failure carried no consequences, potentially encouraging similar failures in other units. Decimation struck what Roman commanders considered the perfect balance, severe enough to terrorize the survivors while preserving enough manpower to maintain military effectiveness. The practice was rooted in Roman beliefs about collective responsibility and shared fate. Roman military units were organized not just as fighting forces but as quasi-familial communities where soldiers shared tents, meals, and dangers. This forced intimacy created strong bonds that could enhance battlefield effectiveness, but could also lead to collective breakdown when morale collapsed. Decimation exploited these bonds by forcing soldiers to destroy the very relationships that defined their military identity. Roman military manuals and historical accounts describe decimation as a tool of last resort, to be employed only when other disciplinary measures had failed and when the survival of larger military objectives was at stake. However, the threat of decimation was a constant presence in Roman military culture, serving as the ultimate deterrent against collective insubordination and the foundation upon which all other forms of military discipline rested. The mechanics of mathematical murder. The implementation of decimation followed strict protocols that combined ritual precision with calculated cruelty. When a commander decided that a unit deserved decimation, the process began with the selection of victims through a lottery system that was designed to appear fair while maximizing psychological impact on all participants. The condemned unit would be assembled in formation, typically in a public space where other military units could observe the proceedings. The soldiers would be ordered to count off, with every 10th man stepping forward to face execution. Alternatively, lots would be drawn from a container, with 1 in 10 soldiers receiving marked tokens that designated them for death. The mathematical precision of this selection process was essential to Roman concepts of justice. It appeared fair because it was random, but it ensured that the punishment would be severe enough to achieve its deterrent objectives. The method of execution was as carefully prescribed as the selection process. The condemned soldiers were not simply killed by professional executioners but were beaten to death by their 9 surviving tentmates using clubs, stones, or whatever implements were available. This forced participation in the execution served multiple purposes. It prevented the condemned from dying as martyrs. It implicated the survivors in the killing, and thus bound them more closely to military authority. And it created traumatic memories that would serve as permanent reminders of the consequences of collective failure. The psychological dynamics of this forced execution were particularly sophisticated. The surviving soldiers faced an impossible choice: refuse to participate and face execution themselves, or actively kill men with whom they had shared the intimate experiences of military life. Most chose survival, but the trauma of killing their comrades created lasting psychological bonds to the military system that had forced them into this position. The execution process was deliberately prolonged and public. The condemned soldiers were not permitted quick, merciful deaths, but were forced to endure extended beatings that might last hours. Other military units were required to watch, ensuring that the lessons of decimation would spread throughout the army, and creating collective memories that would influence behavior long after the immediate crisis had passed. Following the executions, the surviving members of the decimated unit faced additional punishments designed to reinforce their humiliation and ensure their future loyalty. They might be fed barley instead of wheat, a form of dietary humiliation that marked them as less than fully human. They might be forced to camp outside the protective fortifications of the main army, exposing them to additional dangers and constantly reminding them of their degraded status. Historical applications and notable cases. The historical record contains numerous examples of decimation being employed throughout Roman history, from the Republic through the imperial period. Each case provides insight into the specific circumstances that led commanders to employ this extreme form of discipline and the varying ways in which the practice was implemented. One of the most famous cases of decimation occurred during Marcus Licinius Crassus's campaign against the rebel slave army led by Spartacus in 71 BCE. After his forces suffered a humiliating defeat, Crassus decided that traditional punishments were insufficient to restore discipline and ordered the decimation of approximately 500 soldiers from the units that had shown cowardice in battle. Contemporary accounts describe the decimation as a turning point in the campaign, not just because it restored discipline, but because it demonstrated Crassus's willingness to employ the most extreme measures available to Roman commanders. The psychological impact on his troops was immediate and profound. Subsequent battles saw marked improvements in fighting effectiveness as soldiers became more afraid of their own commander than of the enemy. However, the decimation also had unintended consequences that illustrate the complex dynamics of such extreme punishments. While it restored immediate discipline, it also created lasting resentment and psychological trauma that affected unit cohesion for years afterward. Some historians suggest that the brutality of Crassus's disciplinary methods contributed to his later military disasters, including his catastrophic defeat and death in the Battle of Carrhae against the Parthians. Another significant case occurred during the civil wars that marked the end of the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar, despite his reputation for clemency toward defeated enemies, employed decimation against his own troops when an entire legion attempted to mutiny over delayed pay and harsh campaign conditions. Caesar's decimation was notable for its political dimensions. He used the extreme punishment not just to restore military discipline, but to send messages to potential political opponents about his determination to maintain authority, regardless of the personal costs. The implementation of Caesar's decimation differed from standard procedures in several important ways. Rather than simply executing every 10th man, Caesar allowed the condemned soldiers to choose their own method of execution, and he personally oversaw the proceedings to ensure that the political messages of the punishment were clearly communicated. The decimation succeeded in ending the mutiny, but it also contributed to the complex relationships between Caesar and his armies that would eventually contribute to his assassination. During the imperial period, decimation became less common, but was occasionally employed during major military crises. Emperor Aurelian used decimation against troops who had abandoned their posts during barbarian invasions of the 3rd century CE. In this case, the punishment was part of broader military reforms designed to restore the effectiveness of Roman armies that had been weakened by decades of civil war and external pressure. Aurelian's decimations were notable for their scale and their integration with comprehensive military reorganization. Rather than being isolated, punitive actions, they were part of systematic efforts to rebuild Roman military culture and restore the discipline that Hochschild controls sonnet for.